The courtroom was silent. Not the usual kind of quiet, but the heavy kind, the kind that made people hold their breath. Everyone was watching the black woman on the witness stand. She held a stack of papers in her hands, her fingers steady, her face unreadable. Across the room, at the prosecutor's table, District Attorney Richard Callaway smirked. His blue suit was crisp, his blonde hair neatly parted, his confidence unshaken. He leaned back, arms crossed, watching her like she was wasting his time. He had won dozens of cases before. This one will be no different. Then, she opened her mouth and began reading. These people are animals. The judge better not let one of them on my jury. The courtroom gasped. Callaway's smirk twitched. She turned the page. They cry about fairness, but they're all criminals. If I had my way, we'd put them in chains where they belong. Murmurs spread. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. The jury stared, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. Callaway sat up straight now. His smirk was gone. The woman lifted the papers higher. I have more, she said, her voice calm. Should I keep reading? A bead of sweat rolled down Callaway's temple. And then, 12 days earlier, the city of Belhaven had always been a divided place. The east side, where the rich folks lived, had wide streets, clean parks, and tall buildings with glass windows that sparkled in the sun. The west side, where the working-class Black and Latino families lived, had cracked sidewalks, liquor stores on every corner, and cops who never showed up unless they were looking for someone to arrest. It was on the west side that a young man named Malik Porter was arrested. The police report said he was caught breaking into a store. The store owner said he had a gun. Malik swore he was just walking home. But none of that mattered. The moment the cops found him, they threw him to the ground, knee to his back, and dragged him away. His mother, Deborah Porter, was at work when she got the call. They took him, her sister said over the phone. The police got Malik. Deborah's world tilted. For what? She whispered. Don't know, her sister said. But they saying you got a gun charge. You got to get down here. Deborah left her job without even clocking out. By the time she made it to the station, Malik had already been transferred to the county jail. His bail? $500,000. That's when she knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. They were trying to bury her son, and she knew exactly who was behind it. Richard Callaway, the DA, had a reputation. He was known for putting black men in prison. He never lost a case, never took a plea deal, and never showed mercy. He built his career on sending young men away for decades, climbing higher with every conviction. People whispered about how he really felt about the people he prosecuted. But whispers weren't evidence, and nobody had ever caught him slipping. Until now. Deborah didn't know it yet, but the moment they took Malik, a chain of events had started that would lead to the moment she stood on that witness stand, reading Callaway's own words out loud for the world to hear. But before that, she had a war to fight. The first lawyer she talked to told her the truth. If Callaway's got it out for your boy, it's going to be an uphill battle. Deborah swallowed hard. I don't care. I'm not letting them do this to him. The lawyer nodded, but she could see it in his eyes, doubt. That night, Deborah couldn't sleep. She sat in Malik's room, staring at his high school football trophies, his pictures, his posters. Her son wasn't perfect, but he was not a criminal. Her hands clenched into fists. If nobody else was going to fight for him, she would. And so, she started digging. She read every case Callaway had ever tried. She called people, asked questions, searched records. It took days, but finally, she found something, a rumor, an old story about a private conversation, a comment someone overheard. Then she found something else, an old contact, someone who used to work under Callaway, someone who still had access to his emails, his texts. And what they found made her blood run cold. The morning of Malik's trial, Deborah walked into the courthouse with a folder tucked under her arm. She watched Callaway from across the room. He was smiling, shaking hands, looking as smug as ever. He thought this was just another easy win. He had no idea what was coming. Deborah sat in the gallery, her heart pounding. The trial went as expected. Witnesses, evidence, arguments. Callaway spoke with confidence, painting Malik as a dangerous thug. The jury nodded along. Then it was time for the defense. Her son's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, we would like to call one final witness. Deborah Porter. The courtroom shifted. People whispered. Deborah stood and walked to the stand. And across the room, Callaway smirked. That smirk wouldn't last long, because as soon as she began reading, the walls of his perfect little world started to crack. And then, a silence heavier than stone filled the courtroom. Every eye was on Richard Callaway, whose face had lost its color. The smirk that once curled his lips was gone, replaced by something else: shock, panic, and a hint of fear. Deborah Porter gripped the stack of papers tighter. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled with rage. She glanced at Malik, her son, sitting at the defense table in his oversized orange jumpsuit. He was watching her, his face tight with emotions she couldn't read. She turned back to the papers. If I see one more of these welfare queens crying in my courtroom, I might just lose it. How do they even afford lawyers? Oh, that's right, our taxes. A low murmur spread through the jury box. The judge's face darkened. Callaway shot to his feet. Objection! His voice cracked. This is highly improper. Where did she even get? Overruled, the judge said. His voice was sharp. Continue, Mrs. Porter. Deborah locked eyes with Callaway. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Callaway, she said, flipping the page. I've got plenty more. She took a deep breath and continued reading. And then, 12 days earlier, Deborah sat on her couch, staring at her phone. The messages were right there. The evidence she had spent days searching for. The proof that the district attorney himself, the man responsible for ruining so many lives, was not just biased, but openly racist. She had gotten them from an old friend of Callaway's former assistant, someone who had access to years' worth of personal messages. Messages he thought would never see the light of day. But now they were in her hands. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She scrolled through the texts, her fingers trembling. The words burned into her mind. Bellhaven is cleaner when we lock these people up. If I have to hear another one of them crying in court, I swear I'm going to throw up. They act like they don't belong in prison, but it's where they're most comfortable. Her stomach twisted. She had always known Callaway was dangerous. But this was undeniable. This was his downfall. She looked up at Malik's football picture on the wall. His broad smile, his strong shoulders, his bright future. She had one chance to save him, and she was going to take it. The next morning, she walked into her lawyer's office and slammed the stack of papers onto his desk. He lifted an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Proof," she said. The lawyer's eyes skimmed over the messages. She watched as his expression shifted. First curiosity, then disbelief, then something close to excitement. "Where did you get these?" he whispered. "Does it matter?" She shot back. He exhaled. "Deborah, if these are real, this could change everything." "They're real," she said firmly, "and I want them used in my son's trial." The lawyer hesitated. "We can't just walk into court and throw this at the jury. We need a plan. If we play this wrong, Callaway will find a way to bury this. He's powerful." Deborah leaned forward. "Then we make sure he can't." For the next 10 days, they prepared. They combed through every text, highlighting the worst ones. They tracked down people Callaway had wrongfully prosecuted, people who had lost years of their lives because of his bias. They reached out to journalists, whispering that something big was coming. They weren't just building a defense. They were building a reckoning. The trial began with the usual pomp and circumstance. The courtroom was packed, reporters lining the back, families watching with anxious eyes. Malik sat beside his lawyer, looking small in his orange jumpsuit. Callaway stood across the room, confident as ever. The trial played out as expected. The prosecution presented its case: grainy security footage, a store owner's shaky testimony, a police officer's statement. The defense fought back, poking holes where they could, but the jury seemed unmoved. And then it was Deborah's turn. She stood up, smoothed out her dress, and walked to the stand. Callaway barely looked at her. She was nothing to him, just another grieving black mother, another woman who would plead and cry and beg. He was already smirking, but then she pulled out the stack of papers, and the smirk disappeared. "They're animals," she read aloud. "The judge better not let one of them on my jury." The courtroom reacted instantly. Gasps. Murmurs. The sound of a chair scraping back as a juror shifted uncomfortably. Callaway's face went stiff. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Deborah turned to the jury. "This man," she said, her voice clear and sharp, "has spent his whole career locking up black men. He pretends to be fair, but in private, this is what he says." She held up the stack of papers. "There are pages of this. Should I keep going?" Silence. The judge turned to Callaway. "Mr. Callaway, do you have an explanation for this?" For the first time since the trial started, Callaway looked afraid. And then, the courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. Every eye was locked on Richard Callaway, waiting. The mighty prosecutor, the undefeated D.A., the man who built his career by locking people up. He was now the one under judgment. Callaway's lips parted, but no words came out. His hands clenched the table, knuckles white. His mind was racing, but he had no way out. The judge leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Mr. Callaway," he repeated, his voice carrying a weight of authority. "Do you have an explanation for these messages?" Callaway swallowed hard. He glanced at the jury. They weren't looking at him with respect anymore. They were looking at him like he was filth. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "These are private messages, taken out of context." A cold laugh escaped Deborah's lips. "Out of context," she said. She turned back to the papers. "Let's try another one. These people don't deserve trials. Just send them straight to prison and be done with it." Another gasp spread through the room. Callaway's jaw tightened. The judge looked at the defense lawyer. "Where did you obtain these?" The lawyer stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, we received them from a confidential source. We verified them before bringing them forward." Callaway jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is illegal. This is a clear violation of privacy." His voice was frantic now, no longer smooth and controlled. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Are you denying that you sent these messages?" Silence. Callaway's mouth opened. Closed. He was stuck. Deborah saw something in his eyes she never thought she'd see. Fear. And then, 13 days earlier, Deborah had never been a woman who backed down. Not when she was raising 2 kids alone, not when she had to fight to keep food on the table, and not when she watched her son get dragged away in handcuffs like an animal. She was tired of being afraid. She knew she needed help, and that's when she reached out to James Holloway. James was a former assistant prosecutor under Callaway. He had left 2 years ago. Some said he quit because of differences with Callaway. Others said he was pushed out. Either way, he knew things. She met him at a small diner on the east side of town. He was in his mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, tired eyes. He stirred his coffee, not looking at her. "I don't know what you think I can do," he said quietly. Deborah placed a folder on the table. "I think you can help me take that man down." James sighed. "Callaway is dangerous." She leaned forward. "So, is losing my son to a system that's rigged against him?" He hesitated. Then he pulled out his phone and scrolled. "You're not the first to come to me about him," he admitted. "People know. They just don't have proof." Deborah stared at him. "Then we find proof." James exhaled, then nodded. For the next few days, James used his old contacts. He reached out to court clerks, former interns, even a few police officers. And finally, he hit gold. A former intern, someone who had access to Callaway's personal messages. Someone who had copied them before quitting. The messages were worse than Deborah had imagined. There were racist comments, insults about judges, admissions of tampering with evidence. It was enough to destroy him. She had the power now, and she was going to use it. The day she took the stand, she had never felt stronger. The moment she read those messages, she saw the courtroom shift. The jury wasn't listening to Callaway anymore. They were listening to her. The judge called for a recess. Callaway stormed out of the room, his face red, his hands shaking. Deborah watched him go. She wasn't done with him yet, because now, the real fight was about to begin. And then, the moment the judge's gavel struck wood, signaling recess, Richard Callaway bolted from the courtroom like a trapped animal desperate for escape. His once proud shoulders were hunched, his steps quick, and his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. Deborah Porter didn't take her eyes off him. She watched as he pushed through the heavy courtroom doors, vanishing down the hallway like a man running from fire. She had set that fire. and she wasn't about to let it burn out. The courtroom erupted into murmurs the second Callaway was gone. The jurors whispered among themselves. The reporters scribbled furiously. Even the bailiff, who had been stone-faced the entire trial, exchanged a glance with his partner. Malik's lawyer leaned in close. "We got him," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "He's unraveling." Deborah nodded, but she wasn't celebrating yet. Callaway was dangerous, not just because of his power, but because of what men like him did when cornered. And she had just backed him into the tightest corner of his life. She needed to be ready. And then, 14 days earlier, the first time Deborah ever saw Richard Callaway in person was in a courtroom just like this one. It was 3 years ago. Another trial, another young black man accused of something he swore he didn't do. Callaway had torn that boy apart. She remembered how he spoke to the jury, how he painted the kid as a monster, as a threat to society. He had made them afraid of him. And when the verdict came down, guilty, Callaway had smirked. That same smirk she saw when he first looked at her today. That smirk that was now gone. Deborah had spent the last 2 weeks making sure of it. After getting the text from James, she had gone to the press. She had fed the story to 2 trusted reporters, making sure they had copies of the texts, making sure Callaway wouldn't be able to bury it. But she knew the press alone wouldn't be enough. She needed something bigger. She needed a witness. It took her 5 days to find him. Aaron Green, a former Belhaven police officer, someone who had worked with Callaway, who had seen firsthand how the DA operated. When she first called him, he hung up. The second time, she left a voicemail. The third time, he answered. "I can't help you." His voice was tense. "You already did," she said. "I have texts, Aaron. I know what kind of man he is. But I need someone who's seen it. Someone who can say it in court." Silence. Then a sigh. "Meet me at the old diner on 5th, he muttered. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. No promises." Deborah smiled. That was all she needed. The next morning, she arrived early, her hands wrapped around a cup of steaming coffee. The diner smelled like burnt toast and bacon grease. It was nearly empty, except for a few old men nursing their breakfasts in silence. Aaron walked in 5 minutes later. He was younger than she expected, probably mid-30s. He looked tired, worn down. His uniform days were behind him, but the weight of them still sat on his shoulders. He slid into the booth across from her. "Say what you gotta say," he muttered. Deborah didn't waste time. She slid the folder across the table. Callaway's messages. Aaron hesitated, then flipped through them. His face darkened with every page. "I knew he was bad," he muttered. "Didn't know he was this bad." "You worked with him," she said. "You saw it." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw things. He'd tell cops to find evidence if they couldn't make a case stick. He laughed about overcharging black defendants, so they'd take plea deals." His fingers tightened on the papers. "He told me once that putting them behind bars was his duty." Deborah's stomach twisted. "You'll testify?" she asked. Aaron exhaled, staring at the folder like it held ghosts. Then he nodded. "I'll testify." Back in the present, the courtroom doors burst open. Callaway was back, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits followed. Deborah recognized them instantly. Lawyers. Callaway had called in reinforcements. He marched to the judge's bench, his face red with fury. "Your Honor, I move to have these so-called messages declared inadmissible. They were obtained illegally. This is a violation of my rights." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Your rights, Mr. Callaway? This is a witch hunt," Callaway seethed, "and I will not stand for it." The judge glanced at the defense attorney. "Mr. Davis, do you have a response?" Malik's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the texts were obtained legally through a source with direct access to them. We also have a witness prepared to testify about Mr. Callaway's behavior." Callaway stiffened. "What witness?" The courtroom doors opened again, and Aaron Green stepped inside. Callaway's face dropped. Deborah smiled. Checkmate. And then, the moment Aaron Green stepped into the courtroom, the air shifted. It wasn't just surprise, it was fear. Richard Callaway's face went rigid, his fingers curling into fists on the table. For the first time in his career, the man who thought himself untouchable was watching his world crack apart. Aaron walked with purpose, his face unreadable, his shoulders squared like a soldier heading into battle. Callaway shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." His voice was rising now, tinged with panic. "Who is this man? The defense is pulling witnesses out of nowhere." Malik's lawyer turned to the judge. "Mr. Green is a former police officer. He worked closely with Mr. Callaway and has relevant testimony regarding his conduct." Callaway's face paled. The judge peered down at him. "You seem nervous, Mr. Callaway." The courtroom chuckled. Callaway clenched his jaw, steam practically rolling off him. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Bring the witness forward." Aaron took his seat at the stand. He was sworn in, his voice steady as he recited the oath. Deborah leaned forward, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment the entire city of Belhaven would see Richard Callaway for what he truly was. The defense attorney stepped closer. "Mr. Green, can you tell the court about your experience working with Mr. Callaway?" Aaron nodded. "I worked as a police officer for 10 years. 6 of those years were spent in direct contact with Mr. Callaway, providing evidence for cases. And in those 6 years, did you witness any concerning behavior?" Aaron exhaled, then nodded again. "Yes." Callaway's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. The defense attorney paced slowly. "Can you elaborate?" Aaron glanced at the jury, then at Callaway. "I saw him throw out evidence that could prove a black defendant's innocence," he said. "I saw him push for the harshest sentences, even when the evidence was weak. And I heard him say, in his own words, that a prison cell is where they belong." Gasps filled the courtroom. Deborah's heart thumped hard in her chest. The defense attorney continued. "You're saying Mr. Callaway deliberately worked to imprison innocent people?" "Yes," Aaron said firmly. If it meant another conviction under his belt, he didn't care. Callaway stood suddenly. "Lies. This is all lies." His voice cracked. His smooth, confident persona was unraveling right in front of everyone. The judge slammed his gavel. "Mr. Callaway, you will sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Callaway clenched his fists, his whole body trembling with rage. Deborah smiled. The walls around him were crumbling, and he knew it. And then, 17 days earlier, the night before Malik's first court hearing, Deborah sat at her kitchen table, staring at a pile of bills she could barely afford to pay. Her son was facing 20 years. 20. For a crime she knew he didn't commit. She had spent the past week fighting, meeting with lawyers, searching for evidence. Anything that could prove Malik was innocent. But the system was designed to crush people like them. And Callaway? He loved being the one to do the crushing. She leaned back, rubbing her temples. "God, I need a miracle." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A text from an unknown number. "I have information on Callaway. Meet me at midnight. Parking lot on 9th Street. Come alone." Her pulse quickened. It could be a trap, but it could also be exactly what she needed. At exactly midnight, Deborah pulled into the dark parking lot. The street lights flickered weakly. She gripped her keys, ready to bolt if something fell off. Then a figure stepped out of the shadows. James Holloway. He raised a hand in greeting, his expression unreadable. Deborah exhaled sharply. "You're the one who sent the message?" He nodded. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." "Of course I came," she said. "If you have something on Callaway, I need it." James hesitated, then handed her a small USB drive. "This has emails, documents, evidence that he's been manipulating cases for years." Deborah's hands shook as she took it. "Why are you doing this?" James looked away. "Because I should have done a long time ago." He turned to leave. But before he disappeared into the night, he said one last thing. "Take him down." Now, sitting in the courtroom, Deborah watched as Callaway's empire collapsed. Aaron Green had just exposed him. The text had ruined his reputation. And there was still more to come. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Green, is there any proof of what you're saying?" Aaron nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And I have it right here." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a USB drive. Callaway's face drained of all color. Deborah smiled. Checkmate. And then, the moment Aaron Green held up the USB drive, Richard Callaway's body went rigid. His mouth opened, then shut, his skin draining to a ghostly white. "Your Honor," Malik's defense attorney said, turning to the judge, This drive contains emails, case files, and other documents proving that Mr. Callaway manipulated trials, suppressed evidence, and intentionally targeted black defendants. The judge folded his hands, expression unreadable. Have these files been verified? Aaron nodded. Yes, sir. I had them checked by an independent forensic analyst. They're real. Callaway slammed his hands on the table. This is a setup. These documents could have been fabricated. You can't seriously allow this into evidence. The judge didn't blink. You seem awfully eager to dismiss them before even seeing what they contain, Mr. Callaway. Laughter rippled through the gallery. Deborah watched as Callaway's lawyers leaned in close, whispering furiously in his ear. His fingers drummed against the table, nervous, twitchy. He was cracking, and everyone could see it. The judge turned to the bailiff. Mr. Green, please submit the USB for review. I will recess court while I examine its contents. A murmur of anticipation filled the air. Callaway was breathing heavily now, his chest rising and falling like a man who just realized the walls were closing in. He wasn't in control anymore. And then, 18 days earlier, Deborah sat in the darkness of her living room, staring at the USB drive James Holloway had given her. Her fingers trembled as she plugged it into her laptop. A folder popped open. Inside were dozens of files. Emails, case summaries, notes from private meetings. Her breath caught as she clicked on the first email. From Richard Callaway to Chief Investigator Mark Davis. Subject: we need a guilty verdict. I don't care what the defense presents. Make sure this jury sees Malik Porter as a threat. If I need to lean on the store owner, do it. If the officer's statement is shaky, fix it. These people don't deserve leniency. Deborah's hands clenched into fists. She clicked on another. From Richard Callaway to District Attorney Office. Subject: jury selection. We have to keep certain types off this jury. You know what I mean. Do whatever needs to be done. I don't want sympathy ruining my conviction rate. A wave of nausea rolled through her. He wasn't just biased. He was orchestrating outcomes, ripping families apart to boost his career. And Malik was next. She scrolled through document after document, each one worse than the last. She found a case file labeled S. Johnson, 2018, and opened it. Inside was a court transcript from another case Callaway had prosecuted. A young black man, 19 years old, arrested for a crime with no physical evidence. The case hinged on the testimony of a single witness, a witness Callaway had threatened into testifying. Deborah's pulse pounded in her ears. She had enough to destroy him. Back in the courtroom, the judge returned, a thick file in his hands. Callaway stiffened. His eyes darted to the USB drive, now plugged into the judge's computer. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Callaway, he said, voice dangerously calm. Would you like to explain why there are emails from your office detailing witness tampering, jury selection manipulation, and direct orders to falsify police reports? The gallery exploded. Reporters rushed to scribble notes. The jury members exchanged shocked glances. Callaway's mouth worked soundlessly. He looked from his lawyers to the judge, then back again, sweat beading at his temple. He swallowed. This is a trap. Someone hacked my account. The judge raised an eyebrow. Then you won't mind if we have forensic analysts verify the metadata on these emails. Silence. Callaway's face twisted into something ugly. His lawyers whispered again, but this time they weren't strategizing. They were panicking. Callaway took a slow step back from the table. His eyes flicked toward the courtroom exit. Deborah saw immediately. He was about to run. The moment she realized it, Callaway bolted. He spun on his heel and sprinted for the door, shoving past the reporters, sending papers flying. The entire courtroom gasped. Bailiff, the judge barked. Stop him. The officers moved, but Callaway was fast, adrenaline giving him wings. He shoved through the double doors, his footsteps pounding down the hallway. Deborah surged to her feet. She wasn't letting him get away. She ran, down the aisle, through the doors, her heart hammering. Callaway was 10 steps ahead, shoving past a group of interns, his suit jacket flapping behind him. Stop him, someone yelled. But Callaway didn't stop. He turned a corner and disappeared. Deborah skidded to a stop. Where did he? Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. Then silence. Deborah rushed forward, rounding the corner, and froze. Callaway lay sprawled on the marble floor at the bottom of the courthouse stairs, unmoving. His leg twisted at an unnatural angle. His forehead smeared with blood where he had hit the railing. The police officers caught up, guns drawn. Deborah didn't move. She stared down at the fallen man, the man who had once been untouchable. Now, he was just another criminal waiting to be arrested. And then, the sound of Callaway's body hitting the marble floor echoed through the courthouse like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything was still. Then, chaos erupted. Reporters and court officials rushed to the scene, their voices colliding in a whirlwind of gasps and murmurs. The police officers holstered their weapons and moved in, checking for signs of life. Deborah Porter stood at the top of the staircase, breathless, staring down at the fallen man. Richard Callaway, the undefeated district attorney, the man who had destroyed lives with a flick of his pen, now lay crumpled like a discarded piece of paper. His leg was bent unnaturally. Blood trickled from his forehead where it had slammed against the metal railing. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. He was alive, just barely. The bailiff crouched beside him, checking his pulse. "Call an ambulance." A security guard spoke into his radio, calling for medical assistance. Callaway groaned, shifting slightly, his eyes fluttering open. The first thing he saw was Deborah. She took a step forward, looking down at him with cold eyes. "You ran," she said quietly. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, Richard Callaway had nothing to say. And then, 20 days earlier, Deborah sat in her car outside the county jail, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had just come from seeing Malik. Her son had tried to act strong, sitting in that cold, gray jumpsuit, but she could see the cracks in his armor, the way his hands fidgeted, the way he looked over his shoulder when the guards walked by. Her baby was scared, and she couldn't protect him. Not yet. As she sat there, staring at the rain dripping down her windshield, she made a silent promise to herself. She wasn't just going to free Malik. She was going to bring down the man who put him there. And she would do it by any means necessary. Back in the courthouse, the paramedics arrived, pushing through the growing crowd. They knelt beside Callaway, carefully placing a neck brace around his throat and checking for any fractures. One of the officers looked up at the judge, who had followed the chaos down the hall. "Your Honor, do we need to place him under arrest?" The judge nodded grimly. "Mr. Callaway is officially under investigation. As soon as he's medically cleared, he's in custody." A ripple of shock spread through the onlookers. Callaway had spent his whole career locking people away. Now it was his turn. Deborah folded her arms. Poetic justice. The next morning, the city of Belhaven woke up to headlines that sent shockwaves through the community. Richard Callaway arrested on charges of evidence tampering and racial bias. Fall from grace. Former to facing possible life sentence. Mother's courage brings down a corrupt system. Deborah sat in her living room, the morning paper trembling in her hands. She had done it. She had exposed the truth. But it wasn't over yet. Malik was still in jail. His case was still on trial. And Callaway, even from a hospital bed, still had connections. She knew better than to assume this was the end. If there was one thing she had learned about powerful men like him, they never went down without a fight. And then, the following days felt like a blur for Deborah. As the media storm around Richard Callaway's arrest intensified, there was a strange feeling of victory in the air. But beneath it all, Deborah knew the fight was far from over. While Callaway's fall from grace dominated the headlines, Malik's trial continued. He was still behind bars, and the clock was ticking. Every day he spent in that cell felt like a countdown, and with each passing day, Deborah felt the pressure mounting. She couldn't afford to rest, not when her son's future was at stake. She paced around her living room, the walls of the small apartment closing in on her. Her phone buzzed, and she immediately grabbed it, her heart leaping. It was a message from Malik's lawyer. "We have a new hearing tomorrow. The judge wants to revisit bail." Let's pray this is our chance. Deborah's heart skipped. A new hearing meant new possibilities. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. But even as she stood there, she knew the truth. Callaway might be locked up, but his allies were still out there. People who had helped him climb the ladder of power, people who had turned a blind eye to his methods. Those people wouldn't let her win so easily. She wasn't naive enough to think the fight was over. The next morning, the courtroom was packed again. This time, it wasn't just reporters covering Callaway's fall. It was the entire city of Belhaven that seemed to be holding its breath. The judge, a man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the court to order. Today's hearing will address the request for bail, he said. We will not tolerate any delays or distractions. Deborah sat in the gallery, her hands shaking, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She had seen her son face worse. She could face this. Malik's lawyer stood, his face tired but determined. Your Honor, we request that bail be set at a reasonable amount, based on the fact that the evidence against my client is shaky at best. The prosecutor, a man who had replaced Callaway temporarily, stood up to respond. He was younger, more nervous, but no less determined to keep Malik behind bars. This is a serious matter, Your Honor. Malik Porter is a known criminal, and even with Callaway's arrest, we cannot ignore the facts of the case. The tension in the room was palpable. Deborah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She could see Malik across the room, sitting in his orange jumpsuit, his eyes dark but hopeful. She knew this battle wasn't just about the court. It was about the entire system, the system that had nearly broken her son and so many others like him. She glanced at the prosecutor and saw the same arrogant demeanor she had seen on Callaway just weeks ago. But this time it was different. This time, they were fighting for more than just one man's freedom. They were fighting for justice. And Deborah wasn't backing down. 22 days earlier, Deborah sat at her kitchen table, staring at a photo of Malik as a child. The light from the kitchen window bathed his smiling face, his dark eyes full of innocence. That was before the streets, before the system, before men like Callaway twisted everything. She couldn't keep fighting this alone. It was time to reach out. She called James Holloway. I need your help, she said the moment he picked up. There's something else I need. I know there are more people like you, people who know Callaway's methods. I need you to talk to them. Get them to come forward. James hesitated, then sighed. Deborah, this is dangerous. Callaway's not the only one who's got power. There are others, people who will do anything to keep him out of jail. I don't care, she replied. I'm not backing down. Not now. There was a long pause, and then James spoke. Okay, I'll do what I can. But be careful. You're getting into something deeper than you think. Now, in the courtroom, Deborah's mind raced as the prosecutor continued his argument. Your Honor, he said, his voice dripping with disdain, Malik Porter is a criminal. His history, his actions, all point to one thing: a violent young man who is a danger to society. Deborah's breath caught. She couldn't let them paint Malik that way. The defense lawyer stood. Your Honor, as the prosecution has mentioned, Malik Porter has a criminal history. But we must also remember the fact that he was a victim of systemic oppression, victimized by the very man who put him in this situation. We ask for leniency in light of these facts. The prosecutor stood, his eyes narrowing. Your Honor, the defendant's past doesn't give him a free pass to commit crimes. It doesn't matter who his prosecutor was. He's still guilty. The tension in the room was palpable. Deborah felt a chill creeping up her spine as she saw the prosecutor's smug expression. But then the judge spoke. I'm going to take a short recess to review the motion. Everyone stood, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. As the courtroom began to clear, Deborah caught sight of someone in the corner of her eye. It was one of Callaway's old associates, a man named Thomas Hale, a former prosecutor who had worked with Callaway for years. He was standing by the exit, his eyes trained on her. Deborah froze. She could feel his gaze like a heat wave, like he was trying to send her a warning. Thomas Hale was dangerous. She knew that much, and she could feel the storm coming. Deborah's heart raced as she locked eyes. The tension between them was electric, as if the very air in the courtroom had thickened. She didn't know how long he had been standing there, but she could feel his presence like a shadow looming over her. Hale was tall, with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He'd been Callaway's right-hand man for years, a man who knew every dark secret the DA had buried. He was ruthless, and he wasn't someone you wanted to cross. Deborah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her. Not now, not when she was so close to freeing Malik. Hale's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't warm. It was more of a sneer, as if he were daring her to react. He pushed past a group of reporters, making his way toward the exit, his gaze never leaving her. Deborah stood frozen for a moment, watching him leave, but the sense of dread didn't fade. She had known Callaway's fall wouldn't be the end of the fight. There were people out there who would do anything to protect their power. But she couldn't let fear stop her now. She turned to Malik's lawyer, who was standing by the defense table, speaking with another attorney. "Did you see him?" she asked, her voice low. The lawyer nodded grimly. "That's Thomas Hale. If he's here, it means something's about to go down." Deborah swallowed. "What do we do now?" "We keep fighting," the lawyer said, his voice firm. "We can't let people like him intimidate us. We have the evidence. We have the truth. And that's all we need." But Deborah knew it wasn't that simple. They were dealing with a system built on lies and manipulation. She had to be careful. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing, and she wasn't sure just how deep this corruption ran. 25 days earlier, Deborah was sitting in a small, dimly lit diner on the outskirts of Belhaven, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. James Holloway had contacted her the night before, telling her he had information that could help them. She was on edge, nervous. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it, seeing a message from James. "Meet me at the usual place. Bring everything." She grabbed the stack of documents from the passenger seat of her car and walked into the diner. The bell above the door rang as she entered, and she immediately saw James sitting at the back booth, his face serious. He waved her over. Deborah slid into the booth across from him. "What do you have?" James didn't answer immediately. He pulled a folder from his bag and pushed it across the table. "These are the missing pieces," he said quietly. Callaway didn't act alone. Hale and a few others were in on it too. They've been rigging cases, intimidating witnesses, and manipulating evidence for years. Deborah opened the folder, her heart pounding. Inside were more emails, documents that traced the corruption deeper than she had thought. There were orders from Callaway to threaten witnesses, to tamper with evidence, and even instructions to coerce judges into making certain decisions. "This goes all the way to the top," James said. "The people we're up against, they'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." Deborah stared at the papers, her hands trembling. She had known Callaway was bad, but this was worse than she ever imagined. She looked up at James, determination setting in her eyes. "We have to bring them all down." James met her gaze, his expression hardening. "We will, but you need to be careful. This isn't just about Callaway anymore. They won't hesitate to make you a target." "I'm already a target," she replied, her voice unwavering. "But I'm not backing down." James sighed. "Just remember, once this door is opened, there's no shutting it again." Back in the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. The judge had returned from his recess and now sat at the bench, flipping through papers, likely reviewing the new evidence that had been submitted. Callaway's arrest was the first domino to fall, but Deborah knew the fight was far from over. The prosecutor stood, his face pale. He hadn't expected the defense to present such a strong case, and he certainly hadn't expected to be on the defensive so soon. He cleared his throat, standing tall. "Your Honor," he began, "we ask that the motion for bail be denied. The defendant is a flight risk, and his history of violence." The judge cut him off. "I'm not concerned with past allegations, Mr. Walsh. I'm concerned with the facts of this case. There are serious questions about the integrity of the investigation. It seems we may have a case of wrongful prosecution here, but we will need more time to evaluate the evidence." Deborah felt a surge of hope. The judge wasn't siding with the prosecution. The prosecutor's face reddened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned toward the back of the courtroom, his gaze fixed on someone in the gallery. Deborah followed his eyes. Thomas Hale was standing near the door again. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and calculating. There was something about the way he was standing, like he was waiting for the right moment to make his move. And then, the tension in the courtroom was thick as molasses, and every heartbeat felt like it echoed in Deborah's chest. She had seen many things during her fight for Malik's freedom, but the way Thomas Hale stood there, just outside the court's main entry, felt like a silent warning. His presence was a reminder that the fight wasn't just about Malik's case. It was about the entire corrupt system, and Hale was part of that system. Deborah's gaze never left him. He might have thought he was hiding in plain sight, but she could see through him. He was as dangerous as Callaway, and probably just as desperate to keep his secrets hidden. She shifted slightly in her seat, eyes locked on the man who had been at Callaway's side for so many years. The question lingered in her mind. What was he waiting for? The judge continued, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. I'm going to set a preliminary hearing for 2 weeks from today to go over all the new evidence. Mr. Porter will remain in custody until then, but I will reconsider his bail status based on the findings from the investigation. Deborah's heart skipped a beat. 2 more weeks. She wasn't sure if that was good or bad. The prosecutor opened his mouth to speak, but before he could continue, the door to the courtroom swung open. The collective heads of everyone in the room turned toward the sound, and there he was, Thomas Hale, stepping into the room as if he owned the place. His gaze locked with Deborah's once more, and his expression twisted into something dark and foreboding. The judge looked up, slightly startled. Mr. Hale, may I ask what you're doing here? I'm here to assist with the case, Hale said smoothly, his voice calm and controlled. He stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the room with a chilling air of confidence. Deborah clenched her jaw. She knew this man. He wasn't here to help. He was here to protect his interests and maybe even cover up Callaway's mess. The judge narrowed his eyes. Mr. Hale, you're not officially involved in this case. You need to leave the courtroom. Hale didn't flinch. He stood his ground, as if the judge's command had no power over him. I'm merely offering my assistance, Your Honor. I have knowledge of the case that could prove useful. The judge didn't look convinced. This is highly irregular. If you're trying to interfere, I'll hold for a brief moment. Hale's confident demeanor faltered, but only for a second. I'm simply offering my perspective on the matter, he insisted. Callaway and I worked together for years. I know things you don't. The judge's gavel came down sharply. Mr. Hale, I've made my decision. Leave now, or I'll have you escorted out. Hale's lips curled slightly, but he didn't argue. With one last, lingering glance toward Deborah, he turned and walked out of the courtroom. His presence lingered long after he left, like a dark cloud hanging over everyone's head. Deborah felt a chill run down her spine. Hale wasn't giving up so easily. 30 days earlier, Deborah sat in her car in the parking lot of the courthouse, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come to the city that morning, hoping for a breakthrough in her son's case, but instead, she had gotten another reminder of just how much power Callaway and his allies still held. But she wasn't done. She couldn't stop now. She pulled out her phone, checking the messages from James. We got a lead on Hale. Someone from his past is willing to talk. That was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. She quickly typed a response. Where? Meet me at the diner in an hour. Deborah didn't hesitate. She started the car and drove toward the small diner where she had met James before. When she arrived, she found him already seated at their usual booth. His face was tense, but there was something else, something like hope. This is it, James said as soon as she sat down. I've got someone who used to work with Hale back when he was just starting out. This person has seen enough to take him down. Deborah leaned forward, her heart racing. What do they know? James slid a folder across the table. They know Hale's dirty. They know about his involvement in rigging cases, manipulating outcomes, silencing witnesses, and they're willing to testify. Deborah's hands shook as she flipped open the folder. Inside were photos, emails, and documents. All of them pointed to one thing. Hale wasn't just a bystander in Callaway's corruption. He was an active participant. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. She looked up at James, her voice steady but filled with determination. "This is the final piece. With this, we can end all of this. We can finally get Malik out of that jail cell." James nodded. "But we need to move fast. Hale's not going to let this go without a fight. We're already pushing him into a corner. He'll do anything to protect himself." "I don't care," Deborah said, her voice resolute. "I'm going to fight. And this time, I'm going to win." Back in the present, Deborah stood in the courtroom, her thoughts racing. Thomas Hale was still out there, still plotting something. But now she had the information she needed. She wasn't going to let him stop her. The judge tapped his gavel, and the room fell silent. "This hearing is adjourned until the next scheduled date," he said. "In the meantime, both parties will continue to prepare their arguments." Deborah nodded, a fire burning in her chest. She had one more step to take before Malik could be free. And nothing, not Hale, not Callaway, and certainly not the corrupt system, was going to stand in her way. The week leading up to Malik's next hearing felt like an eternity. Every day was a new battle. Every moment, a new reminder of the immense power the system held over her family. But Deborah had learned to fight. She had no choice. She spent the next several days combing through the files James had given her, cross-referencing every detail with the evidence they had already presented. It felt like putting together a puzzle that had been scattered across a dozen different tables, and time was running out. James's contact, the former associate of Thomas Hale, was waiting for their meeting. The witness had agreed to testify, but only if they could promise him safety. The stakes were high. Hale was dangerous, and the moment the man took the stand, he would be marked. But Deborah was prepared to take that risk. Every time she thought about her son, locked up behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, a surge of anger rose in her chest. She wasn't doing this just for Malik. She was doing it for every person like him, trapped in a system that didn't care about their innocence. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at a new file on her laptop. It contained testimony from an informant who had worked with Hale years ago, detailing how Hale had used his connections to silence witnesses and intimidate anyone who threatened his success. The depth of the corruption in Belhaven was staggering. This wasn't just Callaway and Hale. There were others, people who had turned a blind eye for years, people who had let innocent lives be torn apart to maintain their grip on power. But this time, things were different. This time, they were going to expose it all. The morning of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with energy. The reporters were there in full force, their cameras snapping, their microphones thrust toward anyone who would speak. News of Callaway's arrest and the mounting evidence against him had spread like wildfire. Deborah sat in the same spot she had occupied before, but this time she was different. Her resolve was stronger, her fear replaced by a steady determination. She had done everything she could. The evidence was there. She had witnesses, testimony, and documents to prove that Callaway, Hale, and their cronies had corrupted the entire system. The judge had no choice but to see the truth. The doors opened, and Malik's defense lawyer entered the courtroom, a determined look on his face. He walked straight toward her. "We're ready," he said. "Everything is in place. The new evidence will be presented, and we have the witness lined up to testify about Hale's involvement." Deborah nodded, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. She stood, her legs shaky but steady as she followed him toward the front. As she passed the prosecutor's table, she glanced at the man who had taken over for Callaway. He was younger, less experienced, but there was something in his eyes, something that reminded her of Callaway. A quiet arrogance, a belief that the system could never be toppled. She locked eyes with him, feeling a small, grim satisfaction as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It wasn't over yet. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. The prosecutor stood first. He cleared his throat, trying to appear confident, but it was clear that his earlier composure had begun to crack. "Your Honor, as we move forward with this case, we request that the defendant be kept in custody pending trial," he said. "The charges against him are serious, and we believe there is a risk that he might flee." The defense lawyer stood next. "Your Honor, we strongly object to the motion. Malik Porter is a young man with no prior violent history. He has strong ties to this community, and there is no reason to keep him in custody. Furthermore, we have new evidence that may exonerate him entirely. Deborah's heart pounded. This was it. The judge nodded, signaling for the defense to proceed. Malik's lawyer motioned toward her. Your Honor, I would like to call Deborah Porter to the stand. Deborah felt her breath catch in her throat. Her knees were weak, but she walked up to the witness stand with purpose. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her as she sat down. Mrs. Porter, the defense attorney said, I understand you have been fighting for your son's freedom. Can you tell the court what has led you to this point? Deborah took a deep breath. I've been fighting for Malik's freedom because he is innocent. He was accused of a crime he didn't commit. But the real reason I'm here is because I've seen firsthand how the system is rigged. How people like Richard Callaway and Thomas Hale use their power to control outcomes and destroy lives. And I've spent the last several weeks gathering evidence to prove that Malik's case was manipulated from the start. The room was silent. She looked toward the judge. Your Honor, I have documents, emails, and testimonies from people who worked with these men, showing how they intentionally built false cases, silenced witnesses, and manipulated the judicial process to lock innocent people behind bars. And I have a witness who is willing to testify about Hale's direct involvement in these activities. The prosecutor leapt to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. There's no proof of any of this. The judge looked down at the prosecutor with cold eyes. I believe we're about to find out whether or not there's proof. He motioned for the defense to proceed. Deborah's lawyer turned to her. Mrs. Porter, would you like to call your witness? Deborah nodded. She watched as the doors opened, and Thomas Hale's former associate, the man who had agreed to testify, stepped into the courtroom. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but he walked toward the witness stand with a slow, deliberate step. Deborah felt a sense of justice beginning to settle over her like a heavy blanket. This was the moment they had been waiting for. And then, the courtroom was silent as the man took the stand. Deborah's eyes locked on him as he settled into the witness chair, his hands trembling slightly. She had seen fear in people's eyes before, but this was something different. This wasn't just fear. It was the kind of fear that came with knowing the truth, with knowing that once you stepped into the light, you could never go back to the shadows. This man, this former associate of Thomas Hale, had been one of the few who knew the true extent of the corruption that had infected Belhaven's justice system. And now, he was ready to speak. Please state your name for the record, the defense lawyer said. James Carter, the man replied, his voice low but steady. I used to work in the district attorney's office. I worked closely with Thomas Hale and Richard Callaway. Deborah's heart raced. She had been waiting for this moment for so long. James Carter continued. I know firsthand the kinds of things that went on behind closed doors. I watched as Callaway and Hale manipulated cases. I saw them threaten witnesses, intimidate jurors, and even plan evidence to make sure certain people stayed behind bars. I knew it was wrong, but I was too scared to speak up. I didn't think anyone would listen. The prosecutor's face turned crimson. Objection, Your Honor. This is all speculation. The judge raised a hand. Sustained. Mr. Carter, I would like you to stick to facts. Can you provide any specific examples of the actions you witnessed? James Carter took a deep breath. Yes, Your Honor. I witnessed Thomas Hale instructing a police officer to falsify a witness statement in the case of Malik Porter. Hale ordered that the officer make it appear as though Malik had a criminal record when he didn't. He wanted to ensure the jury saw Malik as a repeat offender. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Deborah could barely breathe. This was it. This was the turning point. James continued. I also saw Callaway make direct threats to other prosecutors when they tried to argue against his methods. He said that anyone who didn't follow his lead would be out of a job. It was all about winning at any cost, even if it meant ruining innocent lives. The prosecutor tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The jury was visibly shaken. The weight of the evidence, the truth of what had been happening behind the scenes, was too much to deny. Deborah could see it in their eyes. They were starting to understand. The next few hours were a blur of legal arguments and motions, but every moment was more weighty than the last. With each new piece of testimony, with each new revelation about Callaway and Hale's twisted reign over the justice system, the case against them became impossible to ignore. Deborah watched, a mix of fear and relief flooding her as the prosecution struggled to keep up. Finally, the judge called for a recess. The tension in the room was palpable. Deborah's lawyer leaned over to her. "We've got this. We've won." But Deborah wasn't celebrating yet. Not until her son was free. 2 days later, the courtroom was packed once more. The final verdict was about to be read. Deborah stood with Malik's lawyer, her heart thundering in her chest. She could barely look at the prosecutor, who now appeared deflated, his arrogance replaced with dread. The judge entered the courtroom, his expression somber. After reviewing all the evidence presented and considering the testimonies of the witnesses, including Mr. Carter's, "I am ruling that the charges against Malik Porter be dropped." Deborah's knees nearly buckled. Malik was free. She turned toward the defense table, and there he was, Malik, his face a mixture of disbelief and hope. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the trial. The judge's voice rang through the room. Furthermore, the actions of Richard Callaway and Thomas Hale have been found to be grossly negligent and in violation of ethical standards. An investigation into their conduct will continue, and appropriate charges will be filed. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Deborah barely heard it. She walked toward Malik, her eyes locked on his, her heart in her throat. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. "You're free," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I told you I'd get you out." Malik held her tightly, the weight of the moment settling over them both. "I don't know how to thank you, Mom. You did this. You fought for me. For all of us." And in that moment, Deborah realized just how far they had come, how much they had fought for. They had brought down a corrupt system, and they had won. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of the trial reverberated throughout Belhaven. Calls for reform echoed through the city, with protests demanding justice for those who had been wrongfully convicted under Callaway and Hale's watch. Deborah's fight didn't end with Malik's release. She became a voice for others, speaking out against the broken system that had nearly destroyed her family. She worked tirelessly with reform groups, helping to expose the corruption that had plagued Belhaven's courts for years. As for Callaway and Hale, they were both arrested and charged. Their once unshakable empire had crumbled, and their power was gone. They had underestimated the strength of one mother's love and the power of the truth. Malik, now free, found a job at a local construction company, and slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his life. It wasn't easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is, but he had his mother's strength to guide him. And through it all, Deborah knew one thing for sure. The fight for justice was never truly over.